Hey guys! So, modern era Civ 3 combat in single player is not exactly the most balanced thing in the world. You can tell that they were late into the development cycle. They wanted to advertise cool things, but they didn't have the time to get everything right. A lot of the most creative units are unusably bad as a result, but some stuff is really OP too. These units vary wildly in terms of whether they're actually usable or not, which makes for a good tier list. So let's do it. Just a note, we are ranking how good is the ability to build these units. So resources is part of that consideration, but we're ignoring technological barriers. Okay, I'm going to start off by raining on your parade and declaring that boats are really bad. I guess not on a categorical level, but as a general category, they're too expensive, they are understated, and they just don't serve any fundamental purpose. With transports, I guess you do need to take units from one continent to one landmass to another. You don't have a lot of options there. So because of that, I have to put the transport in does its job tier. It doesn't do it well, but you got to do it, right? And it doesn't make you rethink whether or not that job actually needs to be done, which would be what the C tier is for. In terms of submarines are actually good because of stealth attack, right? You can just like kill the submarine under the stack of boats, making the rest of the boats in this list kind of useless in a sense, except for maybe destroyers. So destroyers have high movement. They are relatively efficient given the cost, how much they cost. So I would put destroyers also at B tier. Other boats though, damn, man, this is getting pretty rough. So cruisers, oh my god, cruisers. So let me tell you something about cruisers and just how understated the boats are in this game. A bomber has about 14% chance of killing a cruiser in one shot. So the cruiser is what 150 shields, 160? The bomber is 100 shields. And the bomber will kill the cruiser 14% of the time. Imagine what 10 or 15 bombers could do. You could just annihilate an entire fleet with that many bombers. They just die, right? Their HP is too low. They need like 1 or 2 additional HP to be able to fight against planes in any successful level. So we're going to put cruisers in F tier. If you want to build a boat, which you really should avoid at all costs, unless it is absolutely necessary, you should build another boat. Do not build the cruiser. AEGIS Cruiser is a strict upgrade on the cruiser. It actually costs the same. It's also the only boat that is buildable that with uranium aluminum instead of with oil, unless you count the nuke sub. So I'm going to put that one in C tier. I'd still prefer the destroyer in terms of their fundamental stats. But if you have no other option, maybe the AEGIS Cruiser is the one for you. Next on the list would be nuclear subs. Again, this one is so bad that it makes you think, like, do I actually want to be using submarines to be transporting my nuclear missiles? Nuclear missiles are pretty good. I would put both of these in B tier. They make everybody declare war on you, so I can't put a unit that does that anywhere higher on the tier list because it is just such a niche situation that you are able to like tank war from everybody on the planet. But given you're willing to do that, they will kill 2/3 of the units on the tile, and then the remaining 1/3 of the units on the tile will be reduced to 1/3 HP. So that's a very strong effect. They completely pollute the land for what that's worth, and they destroy a bunch of buildings if you fire them on the city center itself. Not if you fire it adjacent to the city. Important note. So fire nuclear missiles at the city itself if you want to damage the infrastructure of the city and the buildings of the city. So nuclear missiles are good, but I'd say they're better if you use ICBMs. ICBMs are very expensive, but they get the job done fast and conveniently. And if you just like use your railroads to get your nuclear missiles to the front line, that is infinitely preferable to using a nuke sub. Again, you have no other option, but it seriously makes you rethink whether this is the plan you want to do or not. Nuclear subs, they have bad stats, and their movement is so low. Like, they have 5 movement. A destroyer has 8 movement. So nuclear subs do not get where they need to go anywhere nearly as fast as they need to. So nuclear subs are in C tier. Let's look at the Battleship. The Battleship, I'm going to put a D tier. Kind of belongs in F. It is kind of a troll unit. It is very slow. So the Battleship is slower than the transport. That means it's not even good at its one theoretical job, which is effectively escorting a transport, because it would be slowing the transport down and leaving it in the sea, vulnerable to being bombed or attacked with submarines for a longer period of time. So defending is the one job the Battleship has. If you're going to do offense, you would want submarines, right? Because you could sink, you could do stealth attacks, and attack through the enemy ships that are on top, especially since the AI loves to build a bunch of defensive ships on top of their transports. And then if you want to do defense, like if you want to sweep for enemy submarines, you would use the destroyer for that. So the battleship doesn't really do anything good. But the one thing that's a redeeming factor, it is the biggest unit that gets or the most expensive unit that gets the wartime bonus. So if you build a battleship, you can stockpile a bunch of cheap wartime shields, and then you can switch to an expensive peacetime building, like a factory or maybe even a peacetime wonder. So that's a good function of the unit. Anything else is just completely unusable about it. So it is in D tier. Okay, and carrier is an F tier. Oh my god, just do something else. One airbase, you take one city, do what you need to do, throw a bunch of Marines, slam them into the city, lose a bunch of Marines, bring a worker with you, and just plop down an airbase. It is much, much preferable, much less vulnerable, much cheaper. And then you don't need to defend the carrier, you just need to defend the airbase, which is pretty easy to do because you can teleport units on top of it. So carrier is an F tier. Find a better thing to do to get your planes where they need to be. At this point, we should probably talk about the two most OP units, and I've done entire videos on them, so I'm not going to talk about them in too much detail. The artillery, which is the best unit in the game, also the best unit in the modern era, and also the bomber, which is a bit sensitive to being intercepted or killed with anti-air in some situations, but it is just like disgustingly OP in terms of its stats. In terms of its strict bombard power, it is ridiculous. So to compare, we're going to look at the F-15, which is also like a pretty damn good unit. I think it's this one. The F-15 is 6 times less powerful at bombarding than the bomber is. 6 times less powerful. It's absurd. The only reason the F-15 is quite good, so you can use it for things like if you want to kill enemy interceptors with a plane that can actually bomb, the F-15 is effective at that. But the main thing is that it gets the wartime bonus. So because of the way that shields line up, it is typically not really doable to get 100 shields per turn without the wartime bonus, unless you have like a Golden Age or a nuke plant or ironworks or something like that. And it usually is quite possible, if you have like a hospital and like a hydro plant in a city and a factory, you could probably get 100 shields per turn with the wartime bonus. So you could do an F-15 every turn. So if you're comparing like an F-15 every turn versus a bomber every 2 turns, suddenly it becomes more of a not strict dominance from the bomber. F-15 is still the inferior unit, but it does some things okay, right? It can recon, can sweep out for enemy interceptors, and of course you can use it to intercept planes that you want to yourself. Speaking of which, fighters and jet fighters, they are the best solution you have in terms of interceptors really to enemy bombers. Enemy bombers are OP. You need something that will kill them. I wish there were some better options. I wish like you could intercept and they would instantly start intercepting and you didn't have to like wait a turn, but they do their job. It doesn't make you seriously reconsider whether or not you need to shoot down enemy planes. No, you need to shoot down the enemy planes, otherwise you're going to have a bad time. Jet fighter and fighter are right here. Speaking of anti-air, let's look at mobile SAMs and Flaks. In the brief window of time between the two, I'd say the Flak is a usable unit if you just need to guard one tile, and I'll say that the enemy generally prefers to like target like your cities. So if you notice the AI targeting a particular city, building like a couple Flaks would be a good way to solve that. Also, if you're worried about like an airbase being bombed out, a Flak would be a good strategy there. Units with flat anti-air will defend against stealth planes. So if like someone is like trying to stealth your walls or your harbor out of your resource city, then a Flak or a mobile SAM would be a good solution there, although not a great one. But between the two, the mobile SAM is clearly the better unit. It has 4 anti-air, the Flak has 2, and then it's not that much more expensive to get the mobile SAM. Although Flaks actually have a solid defense value too. It's not the worst thing in the world. They're in C tier. We'll put them at the top of C tier though, for that reason. Okay, so next on the list, while we're on the subject of planes, is the stealth fighter. So again, if bombers did not exist in this game, stealth fighters would be okay. So they're 120 shields, but you do get the wartime bonus for them. They can't intercept, but they have the same bombing power of the F-15. So like I said, the F-15 has 1/6 the bombing power of a bomber, but the stealth fighter cannot intercept, but it is a stealth plane. So stealth planes only get intercepted 5% of the time. Bombers get intercepted 50% of the time. Like if you have a jet fighter set to interception, then half the time, if something bombs within the range of interception, then your jet fighter will intercept it. Stealth fighter, that's 5% of the time. So you actually need a lot of interceptors before you can reliably shoot down stealth planes. So because of that, like if bombers just didn't exist in the game, the stealth fighter would be a pretty solid option for attacking people with. It could also do stealth bombing. So that's precision bombing. It lets you target buildings. So getting rid of walls, getting rid of, if they have civil defense in the city, or harbors or airports. Like military infrastructure can be actually quite valuable in a lot of situations to get rid of in a targeted strike. These are 120 shields, so a little bit more than the jet fighter or the F-15, but they have the same bombing power, and that is still cheaper. Like 120 shields that you get the wartime bonus for is cheaper than 100 shields that you don't get the wartime bonus for. So in theory, in a lot of ways, unless you're like paying gold and buying it, the stealth fighter is kind of arguably cheaper than the bomber. Still a far worse unit because much weaker bombing power, but it is a usable unit, and if the bomber didn't exist, then the stealth fighter would be a very solid option for modern era combat. So let's talk about the cruise missile. Oh my god. I had to check because the wiki page says that this thing didn't have lethal bombard. It does have lethal bombard. It is also very cheap, but if you compare this to just like a regular piece of artillery, it is just absolute garbage. You lose it, right? When you fire it, you lose it instantly. I would much prefer firing with artillery or firing with bombers to firing a cruise missile. You could also just like dump a tank into it. Like you could just attack with a tank. Like the only disadvantage there is that they can get promotions if they win. But if you attack with the tank, you can win. If you attack with a cruise missile, you're going to do maximum 3 points of damage. It has a rate of fire of 3, if I'm not mistaken. And then you will just lose the cruise missile. It is just a terrible deal in almost every situation. So I'm going to put it at the top of F tier. It will at least do something, but it's just so much worse than all the other options that it has to go there. You know what? I'll put it at the bottom of D, just in case you have aluminum but you do not have oil. That's the only situation I can imagine, really. I don't think it'll be controversial to put both modern armor and Panzers in A tier. I don't know, maybe people want me to put them higher, but 3 moves, they're very good. They just, like, once the enemy has, like, radar towers down and they have, like, metropolises with the 100% city bonus, you really need bombardment to weaken those targets. So I would put them at the top of A tier. They're quite good units. Same thing with mechs, right? Mechs are draftable too. Strong unit. I like mechs. We'll put them at the middle part of A tier. Tanks, on the other hand, tanks are just not quite strong enough. I know a lot of you guys are probably used to fighting, like, pikemen with your tanks, and if you're doing that, I'm sure the tank is the most fantastic unit and the most wonderful power spike on the tech tree. But if you're fighting other units of the comparable era, tanks are just not that good. Given their cost, attacking into cities, or especially attacking into metropolises, because by the time you have tanks, you're almost certainly fighting metropolises. They just do not have the attack power to blitz through. They do have blitz, though, which makes them good at farming military-grade leaders. Panzers are especially good. But tanks, they're good units, but they leave a lot to be desired. You need to use other tactics to effectively conquer advanced enemies. Other tactics like the helicopter? No, absolutely not. So the helicopter actually goes in D tier, because when I compared it to the Paratrooper and to the modern Paratrooper, these units are just so incredibly, unbelievably bad. Like, if you compare the stats of the regular Paratrooper to the stats of, like, a Mech Infantry or a tank or a Tau, which, like, cost, like, a comparable amount, it is just, like, night and day. The only thing that these guys can do is airdrop, and they can only airdrop within 6 tiles. What are you doing there? Like, I guess maybe they have, like, an aluminum on a mountain you want to pillage? What's the point? So my thinking is that if you really want to do airdrops, you could probably just use a helicopter and airdrop Taus, because then at least you have a unit that has passable stats in terms of attack and defense. Actually, Taus are pretty good. We'll talk about them in a bit, but Taus are actually quite good. You would have to worry about interceptors in this case, but let's assume that you clear out the interceptors. Then it would be, like, not the most troll tactic in the world to, like, airdrop some Taus on top of key resource tiles behind enemy lines. But just because of the cost of the unit, using either of these, even though they cannot be intercepted. So the airdrop function cannot be intercepted. But just the stats are weak. Like, you've intercepted yourself by building such a weak unit. 4 attack, 9 defense. You're just going to get attacked. They're just going to attack your unit and kill it. What are you doing with your life? And the helicopter can recon too. Recon's always nice. Okay, Marine. This is exactly why the does its job tier exists, because if the enemy has an island that is 1 tile big, there is no other unit in the game that can take that city. You need to use a Marine. So the Marine does its job, and it is not the most inefficient attacker imaginable. It's borderline okay. The tech path is a little awkward sometimes, but we're not talking about techs here. We're just talking about the ability to build the unit, and having the ability to build this unit is pretty solid. Also, if you're like invading another continent, if you land next to their city, they get a whole turn to move their entire army on railroads to defend their own city or to attack your units that you landed. Now, the AI won't really do that as much as they could, so it's not as much of a factor. But in theory, that's a bit of a weakness, and this is a strength of the Marine, that they can just instantly take the city. You can instantly start helicoptering your units in. Just kidding, of course. But you'd bring a transport, you'd put the worker down, you'd build an airbase with the worker, and then you would airlift the units in from home. If you build like 20 air bases or airports at home, you can airlift in 20 units, and then just all of your planes. Just like 50 planes if you want, 100 planes. There's no cap. So Marines can do something in theory quite strong. It will be a bit of a cost. You're going to lose a lot of Marines. They're not very efficient attackers. You're kind of going to be tossing them at the city until you take the city, and hopefully the city is not too well guarded. But once you do, the payoff is quite big. So I would say that Marines are a good unit. Now, TOWs. TOWs, if you compare them, I was going to put infantry on this tier list, like rank them, and I'd rank them pretty well. But next to infantry, I realized that TOWs are they just dominate, right? They don't require any resource, and they have much higher attack and defense. In fact, these are the only thing keeping AIs that don't have res in the game to a certain extent in the modern era. These were like an addition with Civ 3 Conquest. The AI would just get run over completely without res if it was not for the TOW. So the TOW is doing a lot of legwork here. You still need other stuff. Like, you're not going to be taking cities with TOWs, but if you're like without res for a bit and you just need something to build, TOWs are like a decent option. So that's why they are at the upper end of B tier. Okay, and last but not least, I actually had to check the stats on this one, because radar artillery, I had no idea. So in terms of the ratio of bombard power to the shield cost, they are a little bit lower than regular artillery, but they have the radar ability, not that important, but they have 2 moves. So one issue that you sometimes have when you're trying to plow through an entire continent with like railroads, settlers, and a big stack of like 50, 100 artillery is that the AI city is just too far away. You can't really reach the AI city with your artillery, and so it slows you down by a turn. So despite being slightly less efficient, this is still a good unit. Like, if the artillery didn't exist, in the alternative universe where you're using radar artillery instead, they would do basically the same thing, and they would do it almost as well. So at the bottom of S tier, I will put radar artillery. Keep in mind that if you have like Leo's Workshop and you are going like late into the tech tree in like a combat or a domination focused victory, I could actually see like mass upgrading artillery to radar artillery being a completely viable and strong strat. So radar artillery, a bit underrated. It's just such a shame that they're that deep into the tech tree, because you can't really use them in 90% of all your modern combat Civ 3 games. Okay, yeah, so I took some time to rearrange my tier list. This is the final list of the best and the worst modern era units in Civilization 3. Let me know in the comments if there are any like niche particular uses for these units that you guys have found that I might be overlooking here. Cheers, guys. Catch you next time.